and we will. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this February Black History Month, Beyond Black History Month. And we have a very special program, as would be appropriate given this being Black History Month. But I thank you all for joining us. Many of you I recognize from our previous programs. I would expect the audience for our monthly program to grow over time as people come to learn about the wonderful job that our education committee is doing, led by Jean and Linda Trump. With that, I'm going to pass this on to Jean and Linda, and we'll begin our program. Thank you all.
Thank you, David. I'd like to start the program by saying that it's Jean and Linda Crump. It's not Jean and Linda Trump. Our panelists this evening are going to be A.P. Thoreau, Keith Plessy, Phoebe Ferguson, and Judge Williams. And let me tell you a little bit about A.P. Thoreau. He's a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and grew up in the 7th Ward. After graduating from J.S. Clark High School, he sued LSU for admission in 1953 and became the first person of color to attend a formerly segregated Southern State University at the undergraduate level. As a result of a legal technicality, one judge heard the case. He was forced to withdraw from the university. His father, civil rights advocate and attorney A.B. Thoreau Sr., who worked with Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, requested that the U.S. Supreme Court enjoin LSU from acting upon the case, which was heard by a 3-judge court. The Supreme Court did so, however, due to extreme prejudice and isolation experienced by AP Jr., he refused to return to LSU. Phoebe Ferguson is also a native of New Orleans and is the great-great-granddaughter of Judge John Howard Ferguson. Mrs. Ferguson moved her business from New York City to New Orleans in 2006, now operating as Bayou and Me Media Productions. Keith Plessy is also a native of New Orleans and is a great-grandson of Gustav Plessy, Homer Plessy's first cousin. And he and Phoebe co-founded the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. And Judge Charles Williams is a circuit court judge in the 12th Judicial Circuit of Florida. When not involved in his judicial duties, Judge Williams writes, directs, and produces documentary films. His film Through the Tunnel won Best Historical Documentary at the Doc Miami International Film Festival. At this time, the program is going to be led by A.P. Thoreau, and we will do about 40 minutes or so of the history and backstory of Plessy versus Ferguson. And at the conclusion of that presentation, Judge Williams will join the 3 panel members and talk about the ramifications of Plessy and Dred Scott and Brown versus Board of Education. And at this time, I'll turn it over to AP.
Thank you, Jean, very much. And thank you for having us on the program. This is really exciting. And I'm very happy that we were able to get everybody involved and get Keith and Phoebe scheduled for this event. I met Keith and Phoebe in 2004 at a conference where a book was being discussed that was written by a friend and a historian in New Orleans by Keith Medley, and it was called We as Free Men. And the book was really about the Citizens Committee members who sponsored the Plessy v. Ferguson case. And La Creole, a research association in New Orleans, sponsored the meeting. And much to my surprise, Keith Medley had found Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson, and they were there. And I don't think anybody knew that they were related to, I mean, they were never involved before that time in any of the research associations or in the historical framework of the Amistad and other places. But it was an exciting experience to see them on stage together and to talk with them. I later had the fortunate experience a few years later, as they got to know one another and discussed what they wanted to do about their ancestors and the culture that they inherited and the notoriety that they were trying to understand and deal with. They decided in 2009 to form the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation, and they're going to talk about that. But before they do, I would like to have each one of them give sort of an overview of their ancestors, and that's how they got involved, because the stories are quite unique. I'm going to start with Phoebe first, how you found out who Judge Ferguson was, and what was it like in the family when you discovered this ancestry?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us today. We are so delighted to be with you. So I found out that I was related to the judge when I was 40. So first of all, it was not something that we talked about growing up. As soon as I found out, I began to research and quickly discovered that there was a book that had just been published called We as Free Men, Plessy versus Ferguson. And a law librarian had told me about the book, and that as I was looking for papers that the judge may have either personal or legal, they said, well, we don't actually have any papers, but there's a book that has a whole chapter on your great-great-grandfather. So that's what led me to meet Keith Medley. And in his chapter, he describes the judge's history, and Judge Ferguson was actually born and raised on Martha's Vineyard. He came from a whaling family, and he was as a young man, he taught on the island. He then decided to go on to study law, so he went to Boston, and this was in the late 1850s. He began studying with an attorney there who was at one time Attorney General. He also was I won't say all the time because it did change in later life, but an abolitionist. And Judge Ferguson didn't fight in the Civil War. He was studying law at that time. But as the soldiers were coming back, you know, the story about how there was so much opportunity in the South, he moved to New Orleans in 1865. And he basically set up shop here as a lawyer. And within a year, he married Virginia Earhart. And Virginia Earhart was the daughter of T.J. Earhart. T.J. Earhart was one of the most outspoken abolitionists in Louisiana. So that's sort of a background that you can mull over when thinking about this case. And his main, you know, what Keith learned about him was that when he got to New Orleans, he was pretty horrified at the fact that we gambled with legally with this enormous lottery company that we had here that plays a huge role in the separate car law, which not many people discuss, but Keith does. So he kind of made it his platform to rid New Orleans of gambling and prostitution. And in that, he fell into the, on the coattails, I guess, of some of the Democratic politicians who were also anti-lottery. And it because his connection, I think, which started around 1877, they, put him on in the legislature for a little while, and then he got back out and he just practiced law. And eventually, when we get to 1892, he's appointed to the bench. And in the District Court A, in which he becomes the judge in Plessy's case.
Shall we move on for Keith now? Phoebe, is that okay?
Yeah.
Keith, you want to tell us about your connection to finding out that you were related to Homer Plessy?
You need to unmute, Keith.
Are you muted?
I apologize, I was muted. I'm okay now, right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Just want to say good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having us. We're delighted to be here to speak about our personal side of this case. In my situation, I was first introduced to Homer Plessy in elementary school, but it was the infamous paragraph that told little about the case and the nuances of the case, but just the fact that it separate but equal came out of the case. He lost, and of course that was the whole scenario. But as I progressed through junior high school and through high school, I met students that were in the case, and often I was asked, was I related to Homer Plessy? And I would respond, yes, I'm related to him, but I really wasn't interested because I'm an artist, and I mostly drew pictures when they were talking about history. So I wasn't very interested in history. And we didn't discuss it at the kitchen table at home either. So the case was one of those things we actually observed as a family. But in 1996, on the 100th anniversary of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, I met Keith Medley, and he had my family there. We all came to this conference that celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. And in that conference, I met several people, namely Keith Medley gave me the information I needed to show where my great-grandfather, Gustav Plessy, was Homer Plessy's first. And from there, I found out more about Homer Plessy, and that would be that he was born in 1863, same year that Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Upbringing was throughout the Civil War as an infant, and as a young man, he was influenced by several activists in his time. Of course, his father died when he was about 6 years old, and his name was Adolphe Plessy. Well, passed away, his mother, whose name was Rosa, by the way, Rosa Berkey. She married a gentleman by the name of Victor Duport, who was an activist and who was active in the unification movement. And her father, Homer Plessy's paternal grandfather on his mother's side of the family, was also involved in the unification movement. This was a movement in the Reconstruction era where 50% white, 50% black workers gathered together to get equal pay. And they accomplished that mission during Reconstruction. But as Homer Plessy was a young man growing at that time and he witnessed many things like going to school with white kids. He was able to marry a white woman if he wanted to. But he did not. He married Louise Bordenave, his wife. And when he was a citizen who was very concerned about education, he was part of the Justice Protective and Educational Social Club, which was a club that came about when Reconstruction was being turned back. And as a young man, he was not only enjoying the rights that he got through Reconstruction, but it was in his DNA to fight for his rights being taken away. So up steps Homer Plessy, not being a member of the Citizens Committee, but very aware of the Citizens Committee. and he was selected as the second test case. First test case was Daniel Daydoun, son of Rodolphe Daydoun, one of the Citizens Committee's most prominent members. Daniel had caught a train that was going to Alabama from Louisiana. But the Louisiana law, the separate car law, was developed in 1890, and it restricted white passengers from riding in the same car. And this is the case when Homer Plessy came up to challenge it. In 1892, on June 7th, he purchased a ticket at the East Louisiana Railroad Depot. And in the process, the citizens already crafted a plan to have him arrested on that train. East Louisiana Railroad was part of that plan. They strategically had Homer Plessy arrested and removed from that train. And it later became, it was first Louisiana versus Homer Plessy, the state of Louisiana versus Homer Plessy in Louisiana State Supreme Court, as it moved from the local charge that he got in criminal court here in New Orleans. But as it went to US Supreme Court, it became Plessy versus Ferguson, because Plessy would then challenge Judge John Howard Ferguson's decision to convict him for violating the separate car law.
Okay, can I stop you there and ask a question about the Citizens Committee? Because this was a planned event, as you said, with the railroad and the Citizens Committee. Who were these people? Were they laborers? Were they former slaves? Who were these men? There were 18 of them, I understand. Phoebe, Keith, who wants to go first?
Well, there were 18 prominent citizens and lawyers. Many of them were funeral directors, former Civil War heroes, businessmen, lawyers. Some of them were editors for papers. Louis Martinet, one of the lawyers in Homer Plessy's case, was also an editor of a newspaper called The Crusader. And this
Yeah, and he was, and you know, he was also a doctor, and he got his education during Reconstruction, when the Black legislators voted for university schools for medicine and pharmacy and law in New Orleans. So you had a cadre of people who didn't have to go to Europe. Phoebe, can you tell us something about what you know about some of the men who were on the Citizens Committee?
Okay. Well, you know, when you're thinking about this case, you've got to look at the whole scope of Reconstruction. And so, you know, after 1865, New Orleans was already occupied by Union soldiers. So they were able to make, I guess, more progress in terms of instituting civil rights laws than other Southern states. But the reason for that is also that we had a very, very educated Creole community. And many of them, as Keith described, they were, you know, they were writers and lawyers and everything, and they participated in the writing of the 1868 Constitution of Louisiana. And that Constitution was necessary in order for Louisiana to be accepted back into the Union. And during that time, there were 49 white legislators and 49 Black legislators, 4 or 5 of which would end up becoming members of the Citizens Committee. But they wrote the first Bill of Rights in New Orleans, or for the state. So they were very active early on in politics and in the efforts to secure and maintain equal rights in, well, I can say in Louisiana, but they worked nationally to organize nationally to make sure that these laws were not going to be ignored or summarily overturned. So let's see, what else can I tell you about them? So all of them had experience coming to the table. This community was so socially connected and progressive, and they were active in a way that I don't think we can even comprehend, because it seems as though every waking hour was devoted to some cause or collective work to support the community, and also to, the reason that Louis Martinet started the Crusader in 1889 was because of the rolling back of these civil rights laws, and they needed a voice to speak out. And so to tell you about them is to know that they did not sit back. They started a newspaper to speak out and get the community to understand what was happening at that time, and to get their support, not just raise money, but to educate them about the reality of the rolling back of the laws by the Supreme Court. I mean, that's the other thing you have to understand, is you don't just jump to Plessy and jump from Plessy to the Supreme Court, and that's the end of that story. The Supreme Court started rolling back laws for every gain that was made from 1866 to 1877. There was also violence, and so they were aware. I mean, there were hundreds of Black citizens were killed or injured in these massacres that occurred around voting during Reconstruction. So they were making progress, but there was also, the desire to return to home rule. But
let me interrupt you about something, because I think what our audience needs to have some understanding about is the culture of Louisiana, and especially the culture of New Orleans during that period of time, which was several years after Reconstruction.
Mhm.
And I can tell you a little bit of something. My great grandfather served. He was a slave in a plantation 20 miles north of New Orleans. He was the son of the slave master. He was well educated. He served for 3 terms in the Reconstruction legislature, 2 terms, 2 years for each term. He owned property, he bought property, he fought with the Corps d'Afrique. These men served in the Reconstruction legislature, which was 1/3 Black at the time, and the lieutenant governor was Black, Dunn. So the culture of Louisiana was very integrated, very mixed. You had the Haitians coming in the Haitian Revolution, many of them bringing slaves, bringing their own property, educating their children in France. Some of the members of the Citizens Committee had sent their children and had been educated in France themselves. Tell me something about that Creole culture, and also what that means, because people don't understand what is Creole, and that there were white Creoles, there were Black Creoles. Creole had nothing to do with the color of your skin or your ancestry. Where did the word Creole come from, and why was it used in that historical context?
Keith, you need to unmute. Keith, you need to unmute.
If you were part of the lineage of the original French settlers that came to the United States, you would consider Creole, regardless to whether you're Black, white, whatever. It was just that first French colonial rule that started this place. And the word Creole was referred to anyone who was descendant of those original settlers. And I think that it got lost in the measure of races where people were trying to identify it, like, for instance, myself, from Africa and to France, homoplexy people, that's where they came from.
So why
Marseille,
was Plessy
Bordeaux,
chosen?
and
Did he
Africa.
volunteer, or was he asked to be the plaintiff in this case?
Well, he was selected more because of his activities. Prior to his being selected, he was one of the advocates who fought to keep public schools open for Black kids when the schools were being closed as Reconstruction was being turned back. So he was pretty active in the community, and he attended many meetings with his father, his stepfather, Victor Dupont, during the unification movement and other movements. He was very active as a young man.
Mhm.
He was a shoemaker, but that was part of the trades of the family. I beg to differ with people say, the Plessy family was activists. That's not so. They
Yeah,
came
but
to
yeah.
America as carpenters and brick masons, builders. They were architects. But the two brothers,
Also, he was independently employed, and he couldn't be fired or not get a job because the white people who knew he would be the plaintiff would not hire him, or they would fire him. So people who could make their own living without depending upon the white establishment were used in these civil rights cases in the South even earlier, before Plessy. Also, you talked a little bit about the interstate travel. You want to go through that again just for a minute?
the first cases. Plessy was the second case. Rodolphe Daydoun's son, Daniel Daydoun, was a musician, a member of the Creole Onward Brass Band. And that's another thing that this culture has as a part of it. The music is actually rebellious in terms of people calling Black folks inferior and not having any kind of smarts or know-how. How could we develop a form of music that is worldwide known and was born here in New Orleans? The jazz music itself, and the fact that Rodolphe Daydoun's son, Daniel, stepped up, and like you said, AP, they were part of the criteria to be selected was that work for yourself, number one, but you couldn't have children. Homer Plessy had no children. Anybody claims they are a great-great-grandson or a great-great-granddaughter of Homer Plessy is not telling the truth. He had no children, and neither did Daniel Daydoun. So when they wanted to do these tasks of civil disobedience, they had criteria to fill. They had to make sure that they couldn't have any children that would be attacked by the racists or anybody that opposed their standing up to the law. So,
Okay.
no, go
I
ahead.
wanted-
You had a question.
No, I wanted to move on and ask you both about your families, wondering how you guys were what are you going to do with this association you were forming? Because you met in 2004, but you didn't form the foundation in 2009. What were you doing in that interim period? And how are your families reacting to what you were considering doing?
Well, Phoebe, you want to start with your film?
Oh, okay. Well, I'm trying to remember the first part of the question was, what were we doing in the interim between
From 2004 to 2009.
2009? So I was working on a documentary film here that I started around 2003. So I was back and forth between New Orleans and New York. And as I recall, even as I was making that film, it was about the history and traditions of the Black Debutante Society from 1895 to 2005, and it's sort of the rise of the Black middle class and how that was related. So I can remember that, having now met both Keiths, I interviewed them both for the film. So the Plessy story plays a role in it, and Keith Medley talks about Creole society and painting a picture of what it was like in the 1890s and early 20th century. But then by 2006, I had finished the film in 2005, and the family that I'd been following lost everything in Katrina. I went back to New York to work on the editing, and it was just way too hard. And I decided that I could do it here. And I packed up and moved back to New Orleans permanently in March 2006. And
Did your family have some feeling about your being involved with Plessy and all the Black culture in New Orleans?
well, I will say that when my godfather found out that I was making a film about Black New Orleans society, he disowned me, summarily just said that I wasn't even from New Orleans, and that, well, that was the end of our relationship. My immediate family, I just have a brother and a sister. I can remember when I first found out that we were related, and I told them, they didn't believe it, even though it was in the Ferguson genealogy. It was just right. My father had actually asked for a genealogy to be done. I don't know what year, but it went all the way back to Charlemagne. And so anyway, when I said, I've got it right here, it's in our genealogy papers, they said, no, it's not. It can't be. But eventually they understood that it was real. And then they were, supportive when we got together to do the foundation. They weren't, asking to be actively involved, but certainly supportive. And now, they're very supportive. And
Well, didn't Ferguson have 3 children?
he did.
Did you, are there any of them in New Orleans, or were they still
Well,
there? Or?
No, one of them died in the same year he died, 1915. And I'm not quite sure what happened with the other ones, AP.
So you never had any contact with any of them?
Those descendants, no. Although that's not true. Through this process, I met John Howard Ferguson IV, who lives in Texas. And when he learned about it from Keith Medley's book, and he was so excited. And he, furthered the research.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I didn't even know he
And-
existed.
Okay. And Keith, what about your family? What were they? Were they interested? Were they saying anything to you about wanting to do this or not wanting you to do this, or what?
I can tell you that the day we met, September of 2004, we met at the Keith book signing. My son Kenneth was attending. He's passed away since. But Kenneth and his wife Linda invited us to dinner the very next day. We had a wonderful dinner. We had a great time, and we just became friends at that point. But to say that we didn't think about forming a foundation at the time. Well, I was involved with a couple of things in the neighborhood while Phoebe was doing that. I was working at the hotel, which I've been there for 40 years at the Marriott. Only 2 blocks, by the way, from where Homer Plessy worked as a shoemaker. I'm on Canal Street, and he worked on Royal Street, 2 blocks away. So just having all that history come back and learning more from Keith Medley as those years went by, I got involved with a group after speaking to my father in about 2000, right before I met Phoebe. And I had been involved with the Crescent City Peace Alliance for quite a while. And by 2005, after Katrina, they organized and developed what we call now Homer Plessy Day, which is, if I can almost do a Superman act for you. If you can see that date is
I don't think so.
That's
I
June
don't see.
7, 1892. That was the day that Homer Plessy was arrested. So we had Kathleen Blanco, then named, I'm holding up a document, and you can see it, it's kind of shiny, I don't know. But that is the document that made Homer Plessy Day official. And that was
Who was she?
2005.
She was governor at the time. Was that her
Yes, she
job?
was governor at the time, yes. And the city council and the House of Representatives approved it. 2005, then on, we met, and 4 years went by, and I was working with the Peace Alliance, and they decided they wanted to put up a marker. And by that time, Phoebe and I again, after 2004, at about 2007, I think that's where we met again, AP, at the La Creole Convention at what was the Chateau Sinesta in New Orleans. And we talked to you then, and we met at the Supreme Court, and everybody thought we were meeting for the first time. So we made the front page of Times-Picayune because they were thinking, oh, well, these guys just met. No, we had known each other for about 3 years at that point. So from that point on, I think we realized how important our relationship was, because like Phoebe always says, people would tell her that when they hear that Plessy and Ferguson got together, they would get goosebumps. And it was just something that excited people. And we didn't know that we had that effect on people. To tell you the truth, we just wanted to be friends.
Okay, so tell us now about the foundation. And we've got about, I just want to clue you in, we have about 10 minutes
Well, Keith,
before
why
we
don't,
get
Keith,
to the pardon.
AP, why don't you do it for 5 minutes and then we'll bring the judge in before you do the pardon, okay?
Okay, so you got 5 minutes to tell us about the foundation.
Okay, so when we were about to do the marker in 2009, by 2009, we had organized with the New Orleans Center for Creative Art, Crescent City Peace Alliance, and we decided we were going to announce the Plessy and Ferguson Foundation. So that marker that sits on Homer Plessy Way in Royal Street today was formerly, it was Press Street and Royal Street at the time. And we had the marker put up. We announced that we were going to form the foundation on that day. And by June 9th, we formed, I'm sorry, not June 9th, I meant to say July 9th, which actually was the date that the 14th Amendment was adopted to the US Constitution. We didn't realize we were signing our papers at Cafe Reconcile in New Orleans to form our foundation. Phoebe, anything you want to add?
You want to know about also what we have done since, what the purpose of the foundation was. Originally it was to, and still is, to honor the work of the Citizens Committee in their efforts to bring this case to national attention and to hopefully get these separate car laws that were enacted in other southern states, overturned and to no longer have, to undo all of the rulings that they had instituted after 1877 to roll back everything. So they were determined to undo this. So we want to honor that work and of course Homer Plessy's ride. And so one of the things we realized right away was that there were very few markers or monuments to Black leaders in New Orleans or to Black achievement. So, we put up that first historical marker with our partners, and we continued to do that, for the past 11 years to honor Black achievement and resistance around the city of New Orleans. We also do educational programming annually around the Citizens Committee history, but also other civil rights history. We bring in writers and performance and legal scholars and just a lot of different ways of bringing this history to the public.
Okay, so why don't we go to Judge Williams now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and bring in Judge Williams now. And you
Okay,
guys
thanks.
sit.
And I'm just going to try to take about 5 to 7 minutes to sort of give you a legal historical perspective on the importance of the Plessy case. It's about 175 years of constitutional history. I'm going to try to condense, but I'll do the best I can. And it's important to note that I don't think Plessy occurs at any other environment other than what was going on culturally in New Orleans. But when I talk to especially students about and especially African-American students, about the 3 US Supreme Court cases that really define the African-American experience in this country, we have to talk about 3 of them basically in this order. And that's Dred Scott, which the ruling came out in 1857. Of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, which is why we're here today, that came out in 1896. And of course, Brown v. Board, 1954. You understand that Dred Scott basically declared that people of African descent were not and could never be, quote, citizens of this country who are entitled to constitutional protection. And that was the status of African Americans at that point because we were slaves. And so that particular opinion basically solidified that opinion of African Americans and their inability to use the Constitution for protection. What Plessy did, and remember Plessy was post-Civil War, post-13th and 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court did indeed acknowledge that African Americans were citizens. However, the big issue in terms of constitutional protection was whether or not that constitutional equality that we're guaranteed under the 14th Amendment applied as far as states taking what are called police actions to separate the races. The court in Plessy obviously ruled that it was appropriate for states to separate the races if they felt under their guidelines and their traditions it was necessary as a police action. So Plessy basically stands for the constitutional principle of equality, but there's a difference, and they make the difference clear in the opinion. There's a difference between legal equality and social equality. And so Plessy made us as African Americans know that yes, you do have equality under the Equal Protection Clause, but states are not compelled to make you social equals. And then that leads to Brown. And of course, everyone knows the impact of Brown. And for all practical purposes, although it didn't directly overrule Plessy, it basically knocked out the legs of Plessy and basically indicated that separate accommodations, separate facilities in the case of Brown and schools were inherently unequal and indeed did violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. So that's it in a nutshell, but what I really want to let people understand about Plessy, and it's an opinion that I think everyone should read. Plessy basically was the case that reaffirmed white supremacy after Reconstruction. It enabled state legislatures to legally enact Jim Crow laws and sponsor state segregation. It stood for the proposition that there were variations in the law about what equality means. It meant that legal equality was different from social equality. And Plessy enforced and reinforced the traditions that even after Brown would take multiple generations of civil rights activism to overcome. Plessy had the effect of hardwiring the views of many whites, especially whites who lived in the South, of the status of African Americans in this country. The images that we've seen of segregated water fountains, of Rosa Parks, of boycotts, of sit-ins, are all in essence the impact and that imprinting of legacy had on a majority of the population in this country. So as we study the history of the civil rights movement, you have to carefully study Plessy, and you have to understand that without Plessy, we didn't have Brown. And I know, and I noticed in one of the chats that there were some people that really think that Brown was a decision that set us back. And certainly that could be argued because certainly the impact of Brown did sort of get rid of certain Black institutions because all of a sudden we had this equality. And so there was a loss of Black businesses. Historically, Black colleges and universities suffered under Brown. Black principals and teachers suffered under Brown. But at the same time, we have to look at Brown in its context. And it's not just a case that's about integration. What Brown did was basically laid a foundation for the civil rights movement. And that would not have occurred had Plessy not been overturned. And Thurgood Marshall studied Plessy very, very much. He read every part of Plessy because he was afraid that had he lost the Brown case, Plessy would continue to be the law for another generation. And so there was debate within the civil rights legal circles as whether or not there should be a frontal attack on Plessy. They decided that they should attack Plessy root and branch, as they said, and it turned out victorious for Thurgood Marshall. But make no mistake about it, Plessy, I call it the social justice tree in this country. And it begins with Dred Scott when African Americans had no social justice, no constitutional rights. In fact, we were not even recognized as citizens. To Plessy, where there was a reluctance recognition that former slaves and their descendants had certain rights, but states were slow to give them if they gave them at all. It forced the hand that ultimately became Brown. But the civil rights struggle was mostly about Plessy. It was mostly about ending those traditions, the fact that many people felt that, okay, you can be my equal, but you can't be my social equal. That was still the residue from Plessy. And so as we look at it historically, as we look at the social justice tree, from having no rights under Dred Scott to having some rights under Plessy to having constitutional equality under Brown, we don't get the 1964 Civil Rights Act or the 1965 Voting Rights Act without Brown, because Brown lays the constitutional foundation for those legislative acts to be passed. And from the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we get Title IX, which although was a constitutional backed legislation, it benefited mostly white women and educated a generation of white women that never had had that opportunity before. Again, the impact of Plessy and Brown on America in total. It also led to the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act. All of these flowed from that same tree that Plessy came from, until finally in Obergefell versus Hodges, which recognizes same-sex marriages. These cases, these constitutional cases, led to that case going to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court finding that people of the same sex had the right to marry. So when we look at Plessy, we have to look at how this Constitution continuously evolved. But Plessy really is the case that you think about, because that was the case that was so difficult to overcome. And that was the case that empowered so many races to say that, look, we have constitutional protection to do this. And it took multiple generations to overcome, and there will be debate that we're still overcoming. So I think I wanted to just give you that idea of the constitutional context of Plessy, why it was so important, and why it was so important it happened the way it did.
Okay, so now we can, I had one question for you, and maybe for the end. How do we change the construct of social justice? And what is there a legal remedy for that? Or is that something that has to come out of a cultural ambition for a country to do? And has anybody ever done it?
Let's save that for the Q&A, and let's make sure we give Phoebe and Keith and you a chance to talk about the pardon.
Phoebe and Keith, go ahead. I'm not a part of the pardon.
Okay.
How did it happen? Tell us how the pardon happened.
Okay, Keith, you're
Yes,
muted.
go ahead, get started, Ralph.
Okay, so the pardon opportunity came up in last fall when a colleague of ours recognized that the January 11th, 1897 would be the 125th anniversary of Homer Plessy's conviction. So after the Supreme Court case, the prosecutors here still decided they were going to prosecute him. So he had to be convicted and pay the fine, which he did. And he essentially died in 1925 as a felon. Now, last year we elected a very progressive district attorney, and that district attorney sought to put a civil rights division inside the DA's office, which he did. And their mission is to reduce the past harms of discriminatory laws, people affected by the discriminatory laws or over sentencing, things that had to do with the prosecution's office. So we approached the DA's office with this question of, is there a way to, pardon Plessy? We didn't want to expunge the case, of course, but we did want to prove that their argument was right and the law was wrong. So that they took it on full speed ahead, and they drafted a letter to the pardon board. And the pardon board was very responsive and excited about this. And a week later, we had a Zoom presentation, which Keith and I and the DA made statements on behalf of our families and the city and the prosecution office. And right then and there, the pardon board took a vote. There are only 5 members, but they unanimously voted to pardon Homer Plessy. And that meant that their pardon would then go to the governor's desk within 2 weeks, and he would have to approve it or not. You want to pick it up from there, Keith?
Yeah. And one important issue in that was there was a tool that was used in order to get him that pardon. And it was an act that was written in 2006 and had sat on the books since 2006. It's called the Avery Alexander Act, and it ties Homer Plessy to what we call the modern civil rights movement. And we always refer to them, since we started the foundation, as New Orleans being the cradle of the modern civil rights movement through the work of the Citizens Committee. And Avery Alexander was a person who carried the torch for the Citizens Committee, as well as Alexander Pierre Turo Jr.'s father, A.P. Turo Sr. But the Avery Alexander Act was finally used to grant Homer Plessy a pardon. And one of the most amazing things about the application that went into the pardon board was the fact that not only Phoebe and I signed as descendants of Homer Plessy and John Howard Ferguson in the Plessy case, we also had the DA sign, we had the Martinet Society's president sign, we had a descendant of Louis Martinet, the lawyer who represented Homer Plessy in New Orleans, and we had a gem that joins us now as descendants of Plessy and Ferguson to the descendants of Justice John Marshall Harlan. 2 of his great-great-granddaughters signed that application. When it was turned into the pardon board, I think maybe it just took their breath away. And there was no way that they could say no, and there was no way that the governor could say no. So I was confident through the whole thing. I know we were all crossing our fingers saying, oh, well, somebody might oppose it and somebody might say something against it. But I tell you the truth, I felt like, Phoebe, like we always said, our feet were not touching the ground. You know, the ancestors were lifting us up at that moment. So we just had confidence that it was going to happen, and it did.
Well, I wish we had more time to talk about some of the details, but I know you wanted to go to Q&A about this time. So how are we doing?
AP, you go ahead and start. And I don't know if the judge or everybody wants to try to answer that question, but restate it, because we only have 1 question so far in the chat.
Well, I was so impressed by what Judge Williams said as he outlined those 3 cases and the impact of Plessy. And growing up and living with all of the things that Plessy imposed upon us. And I had the privilege as a child, a young adult, a teenager, of driving Thurgood and his colleagues around the city when they would come to the Fifth Circuit Court and when they were getting ready to do the Brown case and all of that. And I would hear, I'd have to go pick them up at the airport or the train station, and they would meet in New Orleans. They love to come to New Orleans because in addition to working hard, they could also have a good time. You know, there was enough social life there for them. So they all like to come and eat and so forth and so on, but they worked hard. They all worked hard. And I would hear the comments and what they were doing. And I remember Constance Bacon Motley, as I was saying to Jean, she was talking about the judges that she had to deal with. And she said many times, the judges were the most hostile people in the courtroom. And it was you weren't just fighting your opponents, you were fighting the judges, and you know where they were going. And it was a tough time. And their lives were always on the line. I mean, they had to do all kinds of strategies in the Deep South to keep themselves healthy. But also, I wanted to ask the judge about how do you move to social justice as a culture?
Well, what I'd like to do really is sort of quote from Justice Harlan's dissent in Plessy. And again, it's not a particularly long opinion. So if you have a chance, you can Wikipedia and read it yourself. Everybody quotes Harlan's quote about our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor lends itself to class among its citizens. That's not the quote that I think is most impressive. The most impressive quote from Harlan, who had his own issues with slavery and being a slave owner and coming from the South. Interestingly enough, it was the Northerners that were the majority of the Supreme Court that ruled against Plessy, but I digress. The quote that's most impressive, and I think even applies today, from Justice Harlan, remember, who wrote this opinion in the late 1800s. The destinies of the two races in this country are linked together, and the interests of both require that the government shall not permit the seeds of race hate to be planted under the sanction of law. And think about when that was written, and think about what we see and hear today.
Today, yeah.
So it's the responsibility, and I think Harlan tells us, it's the responsibility of us who vote, who produce these legislators, that they have to understand that what they write, what they say, and what they do basically plants the seed of hatred, whether it's against race, whether it's against ethnicity, whether it's against sexuality, whatever. And so I think the responsibility is on us to make certain that the legislature, and the courts always have to respond to the legislature, make certain that race hatred, hatred of others is not tolerated. And we may have to do that with an organized strategy, but I think that is the key, to nip this at the bud, because the hatred that's going on today is baseline hatred. In this community in Sarasota, just this past week, we've had a number of anti-Semitic attacks in terms of literature that's been placed in people's yards. I mean, this is 2022 and this is still going on, hateful literature. So it's up to us on a grassroots level to basically nip it at the bud. So, that's my advice.
AP, I think Phoebe has an important book she wants to talk about that maybe some people want to read. Phoebe?
Okay. With our connection, our new found connection with the descendants of Judge Harlan, we learned that a friend of theirs, Peter, I forget his last name, to look it up, wrote this incredible book about John Harlan, his whole life history. And it is absolutely phenomenal. And this story about his brother born as a slave, lived with the Harlans, educated by Harlan's father, and then went on to be this unbelievable human being, which I don't want to give you too much information, but it is a page turner. And in terms of giving you insight into what was going on around the country, but into these two characters, is just definitely worth a read.
What's the title of the book?
It's The Great Dissenter.
The Great Dissenter.
Yeah.
And did the author, do you remember his name?
I have to look it up real quick. It's Peter something.
All right.
There was a statement that was in the chat about Zora Hurston not being in favor of Brown versus Board of Ed, and I think the judge touched on it already. But her concerns were about this desegregation and what would happen, especially the loss of a lot of Black principals, coaches, and schools. Do any of you have an opinion on that particular part of what this did when we passed Brown versus Board of Ed, and we only have a minute left?
I will say this, and this is anecdotal. I had the opportunity to meet the clerk for Earl Warren. His name was Earl Pollock. He's long deceased now, but He actually lived here in Sarasota, and I asked him that very question, whether or not there were any regrets about the impact that Brown had in terms of basically dissolving a lot of Black businesses, basically getting rid of a lot of teachers and things of that nature. That was the most immediate impact. The immediate impact of Brown is that it got rid of almost 75% of the Black principals in the United States, just got rid of them. And so it was a tremendous impact. But, you know, Earl Pollack, who takes credit for not writing the opinion, but I think he actually did write the Brown opinion, he said that that was not our job. Our job was to ask and answer a specific question, what occurred in this country with Plessy. And we answered, and we said that that was wrong. And it's up to the legislature and the people and the voters to make certain that the spirit of Brown is taken to what it was meant to do, and that was to make this country equal for everyone. So Brown gets blamed for a lot, but it wasn't Brown that got rid of Black principals. It was the school boards that got rid of them. In terms of Black businesses, it was urban renewal. It was all of the things that came after Brown that had nothing to do with the case that really was devastating to the Black community, and we're still recovering from it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I regret to say that we're at 5, a little after, and so we know some people have to leave. But if the 4 of you want to stay on, we would allow some other questions. But David, do you have anything you want to say before we close out as we talk about where you can find this and everything? David?
Just to thank everybody, our guest, obviously, and everybody participating. And as Linda said, we'll keep the Zoom open for conversations for those who want to stay. The recording will be available on our Manasota Asala website, probably later this week, and encourage everybody to share it broadly. Excellent, excellent job, everyone. Thank you.
And Marion, if you'll unspotlight them, and if other people want to come on, we can stop the recording and go on a little longer. They promised they'd stay for a little while. So
As long as you like.
if Marion